So in the previous lesson, I had conceptualized the unit circle. Here in this lesson, we have techniques more about memorizing the unit circle, and it makes it much faster and easier to recall certain ratios. So, for instance, if we were to determine what's the sine of I don't know 5 pi/6 or something like that, if you know that it's in quadrant 2, really what you're doing is you're finding the sine of pi/6, which you know is 1/2, and then you know that sine of 5 pi/6 must also be 1/2, because 5 pi/6 is in quadrant 2, where it's all students take calculus. Students being in quadrant 2, right, means that sine of any angle there will be positive. Therefore, if you were to take sine of 5 pi/6, it gives you a positive value, and you know that because you were just finding sine of pi/6. So whatever value you get from there is really sine of 5 pi/6. But then you have to look at the whether it's positive or negative, and you know that by the fact that here in quadrant 2, and taking sine of any particular angle will give you a positive value, because the y coordinate in the second quadrant is really just positive. So really these are the reference angles, and we already know that. But how do we exactly determine, and how can we know this by heart, that 5 pi/6 is in quadrant 2? So what I tend to do here is, so let's look at this angle here. Really, you should always think this as, what does this correspond to? Which of these reference angles is this angle over here corresponding to? And if you think about this, really, if you were to draw a triangle here, you would probably extend the line something like this, and really your reference angle would be this. So essentially, this is the reference angle that the point here is really referring to is this angle over here, right? Which is really pi/3 from here. So this corresponds to this. And the way to memorize it is that you know that these are the reference angles. So the numerator value here has to be 1 less than the denominator value, really. So here this angle would be 2 pi/3. Now looking at this point here, right, we see that this point is somewhere here in the center, and again, if we draw this triangle here, we know that the reference angle would be here. This corresponds to this pi/4 angle over there, and so knowing that it has to be the numerator value has to be 1 less than the denominator, we would just say that this angle must be 3 pi/4. And then looking at our last one over here, we know that the triangle for this one would be quite simple. It would just be this reference angle here for this one. And so knowing that this is pi/6, because that's the reference angle for this, and knowing that in the second quadrant it has to be 1 less, we would just say that this one is 5 pi/6. So it's pretty easy if you just know the idea that the numerator, the numerical value in the numerator has to be 1 less than the denominator value. Now looking at quadrant 3, a different rule applies, but it's quite simple. So the numerator value has to be 1 greater than the denominator value. So now if we look at this angle over here, right, so exactly what does this correspond to? It actually corresponds to, because it's a smaller angle, so we should know that it corresponds to pi/6 as the reference angle. The fact that the numerator has to be 1 greater than the denominator means that this will be 7 pi/6. Similarly, looking at this, we know that this is referring to pi/4, so it has to be 5 pi/4. And then the last one here, we know is the largest reference angle here, referring to pi/3. Therefore, this one would have to be 4 pi/3. And again, we know that this angle here, obviously this is pi/2, this is pi, that's just 90, 180 degrees, and this one's 3 pi/2. And the rule over here is quite interesting, because what do you do with this rule is that you have to multiply the denominator by 2. So what I mean by that is, for instance, we have something like this, right? Now this over here is obviously referring to a much larger angle, I would say, right? Because it's this entire angle when we talk about its reference angle. So it has to be pi over 3 that we're looking at. The rule states that you have the denominator value, right? You times that by 2 and then you subtract 1 from it. So 3 times 2 is 6. Subtract 1 from it, you get 5 pi over 3. So this one has to be 5 pi over 3. And then this angle over here, again, refers to the pi over 4. So if you times 4 by 2 and subtract 1 from it, you get 7 pi over 4. And then this is your last one. Obviously, this one has the smallest reference angle, being pi over 6. So again, you would multiply 6 by 2 and subtract 1 from it, and you will get 11 pi over 6. And again, this you could say is 2 pi really, in essence 2 pi, or it's just 0. So so that's just the technique, those are the techniques that you should know. Again, you know the reference angles, and really these values in the second quadrant, you see that the numerator is 1 less. In the third quadrant, the numerator is 1 greater. For the denominator, you're multiplying the denominator of the reference angle by 2 times, and then subtracting 1 from it, as I've shown here. So thanks for watching.